Welcome, everyone. I'm Jack Llewellyn, and this is Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. So in our last video, we talked about fentanyl. We talked about what fentanyl is, how it's made, its effect on the body, and why it's so dangerous. Today, we're going to talk more about the fentanyl crisis itself. Most specifically, we're going to talk about how blame has been assigned in the fentanyl crisis. Particularly, we're going to look at Mexico and China, and then we're also going to look at the United States. Let's start off with China, though. Something I want you to absolutely know that I believe 100%. The politicians, the people in the media who are saying the fentanyl crisis is all China's fault are completely and totally wrong. Okay? There's a lot of blame to go around, and we're going to talk about that. The other thing to recognize when we're talking about China are a couple of well-entrenched societal issues in China. So historically, China's bureaucracy has been clumsy, it's been understaffed, and it's had a very difficult time controlling different industries, including the chemical industry. We also know that there are different layers of government in China, as in many places, and oftentimes they're at odds with one another. Local officials are far more likely to be willing to look at economic benefit in the short term as opposed to maybe long-term or broader regulation of the state government. Local governments sometimes are simply more able to be corrupted. And industry regulations oftentimes are confusing and poorly enforced. Frankly, that's no different than almost any other country in the industrial world, right? I think you could say the same thing about the United States or other countries at various times. The other thing that's entrenched in Chinese society is the idea of organized crime. Chinese organized crime is very organized, pun intended, and is involved in the drug trade. Fentanyl, methamphetamine, whatever the case may be, at all stages. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but Chinese organized crime is there on the front end, it's on the back end, it's in the middle. Prior to about 2019, almost all of the fentanyl coming from China into the United States came in kind of the mail service, whether it's the U.S. Postal Service or FedEx or UPS or whatever. But that's how almost all of it came across. Then in 2019, China actually took action. So all the people who say China's never done anything are absolutely wrong. In 2019, they took a step to classify and schedule fentanyl and some of its precursors as narcotics, as illegal narcotics, as things that could not be shipped out of the country. And about that time, so we're talking, the beginning of 2019 till about October 2019. During that period, there was a steady decline where almost no fentanyl from China now flows directly into the United States. So that was pretty powerful, right? But drug dealers are resourceful. They're smart. And so what they started to do is to work to develop other precursors, other fentanyl analogs that could be used in the production of fentanyl. And what they then did is started moving those precursors out of the country to places like Mexico, and it became very hard to regulate because some of those other precursors have legitimate uses, right? So if you have something that's got a legitimate use and an illegitimate use, if you don't really know what the end user is going to do, it's very, very hard to figure out how to regulate that. The DEA's threat assessment report, again, has said that Chinese chemists are increasingly focused on precursors and the precursors to precursors, again, many of which have legitimate uses and are therefore hard to regulate. Now, the other thing that's important about China is the way in which they work on the back end. And most analysts, including the DEA and the State Department, have said that it's the Chinese money laundering organizations that really provide a service to the cartels in Mexico that allows for the manufacturer of fentanyl in Mexico using Chinese chemicals. that it's that deeply entrenched network of money laundering that allows the whole operation to work. And something that I didn't know, I talked about this in my podcast last week. Something I really didn't know is the degree to which the State Department and the DEA say that there are Chinese nationals who have become very entrenched in Mexican society. So a DEA official who was testifying before Congress had said, they're very skilled, they're very compartmentalized, they're very covert, and they're not going to draw attention like the cartels do with violence and kidnappings and all of the other horrendous things they do. He goes on to say they're operating really with impunity, and no longer are they foreign entities in Mexico. Their kids are born in Mexico. The generation now, they're Chinese organized crime in Mexico that are part of the Mexican culture. Now, before we go to Mexico, we should note that fentanyl production, the production of precursors for fentanyl, and then, of course, the precursors of precursors, are also coming from India and also from Southeast, the Golden Triangle region, which is another hotspot. And so even if China cracks down more, that's not to say the flow of precursors and the flow of the necessary components to manufacture large quantities of high-level fentanyl won't flow into Mexico, right? If everything stopped from China tomorrow, how long do you think it would take people in India, the Golden Triangle, and other places to fill that void? I submit it wouldn't be very long. Now, what do we know about Mexico? Well, we know that after the precursors are made, they're shipped from China into Mexico, and Mexico then produces them. Remember, we talked last time, they produce them, they stamp them into pills that look like Adderall or Xanax. According to the DEA, 2 out of 5 fake pills. So pills that look like Adderall or Xanax that aren't, that are supposed to be, the illegal counterparts to legal prescription drugs. 2 out of 5 of those contain fentanyl, which is really pretty incredible if you think about it. Last week, there was a congressional hearing talking about the fentanyl crisis. Really, it said almost nothing and was a lot more posturing than anything else. And I know that surprises everybody. But some testimony that was interesting is DEA officials said that the 2 cartels they're worried about are CDS and CJNG. We knew that. And one of them actually said that those 2 pose the greatest criminal drug threat the United States has ever faced. Went on to say, these ruthless, violent criminal organizations have associates, facilitators, and brokers in all 50 states, as well as more than 40 countries around the world. And then it says, something that we just said, even if the Chinese government started regulating fentanyl and all the variations of fentanyl, what do the Mexican cartels do? They start sending for the precursors in other places. And now they're starting to develop their own precursors or their own alternatives. So, the chemicals come over, they get made by chemists in Mexico. Some of those chemists are pretty smart, right? I saw a video not long ago where there was somebody who was actually making methamphetamine for the CJNG. And he's going through and doing everything. And the reporter said something to the effect of, boy, you're really good at this. You must have done well in chemistry in school. And he says, I'm a biochemical engineer, but I can make a whole lot of money doing this in the evenings. So those Mexican cartels and their chemists are figuring out the precursors too, so that they're not so dependent on those precursors coming from China or India or other parts of the country. In that congressional hearing too, the DEA said that they are laser focused on the cartels and the fentanyl and methamphetamine they are producing. They also said, we need more cooperation from Mexican authorities. And one of the big boogeymen that was put out there during this hearing was the use of social media and the fact that social media is being used to sell fentanyl and fentanyl precursors and fake pills that have fentanyl in a way that's totally different than it had ever been in the past, and in ways that are very difficult for the governments to regulate. In fact, he said, it's very clear that social media has become a superhighway for drugs, and that drug trafficking organizations are practically advertising and actually completing sales and effectuating payment using social media applications. The DEA administrator also said that the two primary cartels, CDS and CJNG, are the DEA's top operational priority. Now, again, we've talked and we'll talk over and over about the idea of if CJNG and CDS went away tomorrow, how long would that really affect the crisis in the United States or the flow of drugs to the United States? If there's still a demand in the United States, isn't somebody else going to fill that? But again, that's what she's saying. The two top operational priorities are the Mexican cartels. Now, what about the U.S.? So number one, you have social media, and let's talk, just characterize that as a broader, you've got the internet and the difficulty in regulating transactions, communications over the internet. That's enhanced by cryptocurrency, right? Stuff that's untraceable, much, much more difficult. We also have the demand issue. One of the other things that I think is fascinating when we're talking about blame is, according to the DEA, 75 to 90% of all the fentanyl shipped from Mexico into the United States comes by land through ports of call. Let me repeat that for emphasis. 75 to 90% of all of the fentanyl being shipped from Mexico to the United States comes by land through ports of call. It's not being flown in. It's not being airdropped in. Drones aren't doing it. Illegal immigrants aren't doing it. It's people driving back and forth from Mexico, or trucks or other commercial vehicles. That's the main source. And so you have to ask yourself, is there a way to stop it at the border? And obviously there's a tremendous issue there, right? You have thousands of people going back and forth across the border every day. You can't stop every car and search. But it's also, I think, irresponsible for our politicians to say, it's Mexico's fault. Mexico needs to do more. Mexico needs to do more to keep it from coming in. Well, maybe we need to do more to keep it from coming in. Anyways, that was a little bit of a diatribe. I talk a lot more about this in my podcast. If you want to go back and look at that, same name, you can find it on all the normal places. And subscribe if you like the information that you're getting on this channel. And that's it today for Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena.